Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something absolutely mind-blowing, the survival tech stack. We're talking about the incredible technological ingenuity and the sheer communal intelligence that actually allowed our ancient ancestors to survive the last glacial maximum. We kind of have this habit of looking back at ancient humans and picturing them as, well, primitive. But the reality? Actually, scratch that. The fact is, they were brilliant engineers, chemists, and master strategists.
To really wrap our heads around this, I want you to imagine waking up tomorrow and your heating is just dead. There's no thermostat to fiddle with, no hot chocolate in the pantry, and definitely no Uber Eats bringing warm soup right to your door. Now, imagine losing every single one of those modern comforts about 20,000 years ago. At that time, average global temperatures were roughly 6 degrees colder than they are today. And hey, 6 degrees might not sound like a huge deal, but to put that into perspective, it's literally the difference between a bustling modern city and that exact same city being crushed under a solid kilometer of ice. For thousands of years, this wasn't some apocalyptic emergency. It was just Tuesday.
And the landscape itself was just breathtakingly different. Because so much of the Earth's water was locked up in these massive ice sheets, sea levels were a staggering 120 meters lower. Britain was physically attached to Europe, and a massive land bridge called Beringia hooked Siberia right up to Alaska. And get this, sharing this freezing world with us were some truly terrifying neighbors. We're talking woolly mammoths, huge cave bears, woolly rhinos, cave lions that dwarfed modern African lions, and Irish elk rocking antlers that spanned almost 4 meters across. These absolute giants were, at the exact same time, the greatest threat to ancient humans and the absolute most critical resource keeping them alive. Section 1. The first technologies. Fire and bone architecture. So how on earth do they actually pull this survival off? Well, it starts with their baseline survival tools. And we really need to toss out our modern expectations about how supposedly primitive these tools were. The foundation of the entire survival stack, of course, was fire. But here's the thing. The struggle to control fire wasn't a new problem during the Ice Age. Evidence from the Wonderwork Cave in South Africa actually shows traces of controlled fire use going all the way back to, wait for it, up to 1 million years ago. So, by the time Ice Age winters ramped up into this brutal survival challenge, fire wasn't some new discovery. It was an ancient, deeply understood technology. Okay, let's dive into this, because fire was way more than just a campfire to warm your hands. It was this complete, ultimate multi-tool doing over a dozen jobs all at once. It cooked their food, which made calories dramatically more bioavailable. In fact, evolutionary biologists point out that cooking is literally what allowed human brains to get so big. We basically traded gut tissue for brain tissue, all because fire did the heavy digestive lifting for us. On top of that, it was a bodyguard, keeping 300-kilogram cave lions at bay. It hardened their wooden spear tips. It provided 16 hours of precious light during completely pitch-black winter days for social bonding. And of course, it heated enclosed spaces. If you lost your fire, you were probably going to die. That made the firekeepers, the people in charge of keeping that flame alive, the absolute VIPs of the entire group. And fire was insanely effective when paired with the right shelter. Deep caves weren't just random holes in the rock to cower in, they were deliberately organized homes. A deep cave naturally holds a temperature right around 10 to 13 degrees Celsius all year long, which is a game changer because when you pair that baseline warmth with a fire, it completely blocks those lethal wind chills that can turn a merely cold day into a deadly one in a matter of minutes. The archaeological evidence shows us these spaces were set up with a real floor plan, stone-lined fire pits over here, sleeping areas over there, and specific zones just for making tools. But what happens when the herds you depend on migrate and there isn't a convenient cave nearby? Well, they built their own, and the sheer scale of this is just mind-blowing. In places like Mezherych in Ukraine, dating back roughly 15,000 years, archaeologists have unearthed massive, circular structures built almost entirely out of woolly mammoth bones. We're talking about individual structures that required the remains of over 150 different mammoths just to build one house. Just look at the engineering process here. And remember, nobody's running down to the local hardware store. They're doing this with stone and bone tools. Step 1, they had to source very specific, curved bones for structural integrity. Step 2, they carefully interlocked femurs and jawbones to build up the walls. Step 3, they tied these massive tusks together overhead to act as ridge beams holding up the roof. And finally, Step 4, they'd stretch animal hides incredibly tight over the whole frame. This wasn't a makeshift tent. It was genuine, wind-proof architecture, pulled off through astonishing collective intelligence. Moving on to Section 2. Paleolithic engineering, precision clothing.
Now, epic bone architecture is great and all, but let's talk about a very harsh physiological reality. Biologically speaking, we are just naked apes. Without some extremely sophisticated insulation, a human standing out in sub-zero temperatures is going to succumb to hypothermia really fast.
Pinning down exactly when humans first started wearing clothes is notoriously tricky. But scientists use a surprisingly clever and, slightly gross method to track it down: lice. See, body lice actually live and breed in fabric and clothing, completely unlike head lice, which only live on skin and hair. By looking at the DNA and dating the exact evolutionary split between those two lice species, scientists can estimate that humans started regularly covering up about 170,000 years ago. But we have to be clear here. They weren't just throwing raw, stiff animal skins over their shoulders and calling it a day. They were doing some grueling chemistry. Through this super labor-intensive method called brain tanning, they literally took an animal's own brain tissue, mixed it with water, and used it to chemically soften and preserve the hide. It's basically nature's own extreme chemistry set. The end result? Supple, incredibly durable, and highly waterproof leather. And to stitch it all together, they used precision bone needles from the Upper Paleolithic that had eyes barely a millimeter wide. I mean, the dexterity required is just wild.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how insanely advanced their clothing designs actually were. Over at the 34,000-year-old Sungir burial site in Russia, researchers found garments completely covered in thousands of individually carved ivory beads. By mapping exactly where those beads fell in the dirt, they could reconstruct the clothing. What they found was a highly deliberate three-layer system: a close-fitting inner layer to manage moisture, a middle layer trapped with air for warmth, and a tough outer hide to block wind and water. Guys, this is the exact same layering advice you'll get from modern mountaineering guides today, except it was perfected tens of thousands of years ago through lethal trial and error.
All right, Section 3, the merciless caloric economy. All that precision gear was crucial, absolutely, but it brings us face to face with the totally unforgiving biological math of winter. When you are exposed to extreme cold, your resting metabolic rate can spike by 50% or even more, just as your body is desperately burning energy to keep your core temperature from dropping.
Because of that intense constant burn rate, fat became the absolute supreme currency of the Ice Age. Fat packs way more than twice the energy per gram compared to either protein or carbs. If you wanted any chance of generating enough body heat to survive a blizzard, you needed massive amounts of fat. And honestly, this is exactly why hunting megafauna was non-negotiable. Think about it. A single mature woolly mammoth could weigh around 6 tons. That single animal provided roughly 500,000 calories of meat and vital, life-saving fat. That immense caloric payoff is enough to sustain a group of 25 people for several weeks. But, as you can imagine, taking down a 6-ton beast with spears isn't exactly a solo mission. It demanded intense cognitive and social coordination. They had to use fire and loud noises to drive these giants into boggy ground, or they'd coordinate these really sophisticated ambushes right at river crossings. Okay, but once you somehow secure 500,000 calories of raw meat, how do you keep it from spoiling? Well, you use the earth itself. Ancient humans deliberately dug storage caches straight into the permafrost, effectively turning the frozen ground into a giant Ice Age refrigerator. The autumn months were this time of totally frantic preparation, drying out meat, rendering fat to store in animal bladders, and whipping up early versions of pemmican, which are basically ancient energy bars. They were highly rational, planning months ahead to buffer themselves against the very real, very terrifying threat of winter starvation.
Which brings us to Section 4, the ultimate survival tool: community infrastructure. This is arguably the most crucial part of this whole explainer. We're going to completely subvert one final modern myth by revealing the single most powerful weapon our ancestors actually possessed.
See, modern pop culture has this weird, persistent obsession with the solo survivalist, right? The lone wolf reality TV star toughing it out in the wilderness by themselves. But ancient humans? They were doing the exact opposite. Hunter-gatherer bands usually numbered around 20 to 50 people. In a brutal sub-zero winter, your individual survival was completely, 100% inseparable from the group. You needed specialized foragers who could somehow spot and dig up edible roots under a solid meter of snow, and you needed expert butchers who knew how to extract every single ounce of marrow and fat from a kill.
So, the crucial point is captured just perfectly in this quote from our sources. The old woman who knew every plant in a 100-kilometer radius was not a burden on the group. She was a library. She was irreplaceable. The elders who held on to all that generational knowledge, they were invaluable. The stories they shared around the winter fire weren't just idle entertainment to pass the time. They were critical, life-or-death survival education. That knowledge is quite literally what kept everyone alive.
And pooling all that collective knowledge allowed them to actively map out their world. They weren't just wandering blindly through the snowstorms hoping they'd stumble across some food. No way. They executed highly strategic seasonal migrations. They carried detailed mental maps in their heads, spanning hundreds of kilometers, moving very deliberately to sheltered river valleys where they knew, for a fact, they would intercept migrating reindeer, bison, and seasonal salmon runs.
They even figured out how to store this critical environmental data externally. You know, we often look at magnificent cave art from 40,000 years ago, like the stuff in Lascaux or Altamira, as this purely spiritual, mystical decoration. But researchers now suggest these incredibly detailed depictions of horses, bison, and aurochs functioned as permanent visual databases. They were literally 40,000-year-old information storage technologies designed to keep records of local animal anatomy and migration behavior updated and passed down across multiple generations.
But here's another layer to it. Surviving a dark, confined winter with strictly limited food isn't just a physical challenge, it is an immense psychological one. To prevent their social structure from fragmenting and suffering total psychological collapse, they had to actively manage the community's morale. And we know they did this because of the discovery of 40,000-year-old bone flutes. This points directly to the deliberate cultivation of group cohesion through music, shared ritual, and coming together.
So when you take a step back and put all these puzzle pieces together, the multi-tool fire, the mammoth bone architecture, the precision-engineered layered clothing, the permafrost refrigerators, and the visual cave databases, you quickly realize their survival was absolutely not just passive endurance. It was active, intelligent, collective problem-solving, functioning at an extraordinary scale. That unique human ability to model future problems and invent solutions together is what allowed them to completely manage and conquer this incredibly harsh landscape. Today, we've basically traded that immense, highly tuned, collective survival network for central heating, perfectly stocked supermarkets, Gore-Tex jackets, and midnight soup delivery right to our doors. So, as you sit in your nice warm room right now, you really have to ask yourself, in gaining all this incredible modern comfort, what vital elements of our profound communal intelligence did we leave behind in the ice? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time.